We're going to talk about cover crops and specialty crops, and I think this is kind of exciting because you've heard a lot of farmers talk about their diverse rotations. They grow X number of crops, and there's a lot of crops that we're not catching in some of those conversations about wheat, corn, and soybean. So we want to tap into some of those crops with our next panel members, Amit Chatterjee from NDSU, Greg Endres from NDSU up at the Carrington REC, and then also I'm on the panel.
I think maybe a good place to start is just what are some of the challenges that are unique to cover crops in these specific systems? And so Amit, maybe we'll start with you talking specifically about sugar beets. You know, what is uniquely challenging about cover crops and sugar beets versus, other crops?
Well, if you are thinking about sugar beet, the main challenge is to convince farmers to adopt that cover crop is a big challenge if you are thinking about that one. And another thing is that um, when we should do the interseeding, that is really a big challenge because sugar beet is a Roundup ready crop. So you need to apply those herbicides and you need to make sure that after this, so that there is not a weed issue or something other disease issue, because you have to apply all those chemicals. And so selecting a date is a particularly another thing that we need to make sure that we are not going too early or we are not going too late for the sugar beet interseeding particularly. That is the thing. Another thing is that actually we having discussion in the morning about this cover crop in sugar beet. People sometimes, sugar beet growers, they sometimes think that, okay, we are really talking about winter rye, not any other cover crop species. You have option for other cover crop species also. Why we are always talking about this winter rye? Because it can sustain it can grow back in the following winter. That's in the spring. So that is that thing, that main three things are, if you are thinking that which cover crop species they should go for, and to find out the benefits actually, why we are going to have this cover crop in our system. That is that main barricade, or you can say obstacle to the growers. They sometimes cannot really figure out why I need to have another crop inside in our rotation.
And what has your research shown, what does the data show are the benefits to answer that concern on their part?
So this main focus of this research work, because it is just like a starting, this is that for the interseeding in this valley area, this is the kind of first kind of research. We mainly focused on whether this introducing cover crops as an interseeding is going to do any negative effect on your yield, root yield, sugar content, recoverable sugar yield, and economic profitability or not. And we did the study for 3 years, and it did not show that there is a significant reduction in economic profitability due to the adoption of cover crop.
And Greg, over to you. You shared in the video at least one of the challenges with this planting green, planting these edible beans into cereal rye was the desiccation, right? The termination timing for planting green. Can you talk about how do you find that sweet spot? And this speaks also to a question that we got from the audience. How do you find that perfect time to terminate the rye?
Well, that's definitely a challenge, and I think it comes down to just some common sense. Just being out there and observing the topsoil. Keep in mind the forecast and thinking about your targeted time for planting the dry bean and of course the targeted time for terminating the rye. So we're doing some other things to help maybe make those decisions, but this is such a busy time for growers here. People are planting, they're spraying, livestock producers are working with their cattle yet, and it's so hard to keep track of everything, and we just don't want people to forget about their rye out there, because if it is on the dry side, we can see some reduction in dry bean yield.
And Abbey, for you on the sunflowers, and we're getting, looks like a few questions on sunflowers here, but how do you get around the desiccation of the sunflowers and killing the cover crop?
Yeah, so that's an issue. I mean, we can look at timing of seeding with sunflowers at a couple different times. So we've looked at seeding the sunflower in 30-inch row spacing, planting the sunflower in 30-inch row spacing, come in and seeding the cover crops on them that same day or the day following. And letting it all grow at once. We've tried also planting the sunflower, coming in a little bit later and interseeding it with the same equipment used for corn. And then we've also flown on cover crops into sunflower when it's after it's blooming, and then we get a little bit of establishment under the canopy. And it always does come down to that desiccation pass before harvest. And that's a real challenge, because when you desiccate the sunflowers, you also desiccate all your cover crops. And so if you're looking for something to carry over, like say you put something like cereal rye in that mix, it will be terminated when you desiccate the sunflowers. Now, if you don't desiccate the sunflowers, it's not a big deal. You'll still have everything growing and it should work fine. But that seems to be the biggest challenge. And I'm not sure we have a way to get around it other than the possibility of after sunflower harvest coming in and seeding cereal rye into that system and getting some additional cover in that place.
Amit, I want to go back to you here on the sugar beets. We talked earlier about some of the challenges that go with cover crops and sugar beets, and you kind of outlined 3 specifically. But as growers are running into challenge, what other options do they have? Maybe interseeding, or what other options they have to maybe making this system work?
Well, they can go for false-seeded cover crops, or they can go for actually it is not a cover crop, you can say, but they can plant some crops during the spring, early spring, because generally they plant sugar beet around like May 15th. So they can go a little bit if they have like a prolonged wet conditions. They can go for suppose like early during this April and May, first 2 weeks of May, they can go for some cover crops to protect their ground, because that time they have significant amount of nutrient losses going on, particularly because if you have like a moist soil conditions, then you can lose significant amount of nitrogen, particularly if you are applying nitrogen in the fall. A lot of growers, they apply nitrogen in the fall. So for those, there are different options to adopt these cover crops, and they always protect some nutrient losses from the sugar beet. Because keep one thing in the mind, it is a tuber crop, so it grows deeper, but that root is not that dense. So in case of particular light textured soils, or even for heavy, high clay soils, there is a chance that you can lose some amount of nitrogen. And in the sugar beet, growers, they apply bunch of nitrogen, but the maximum uptake or you can say that nitrogen uptake rate is happening during this June and July, not even May. Means suppose like if you plant it during May 15th, it takes some time to get germinated, and then suppose like their vegetative growth, peak vegetative growth starts from the like first week of June. So during that time, these cover crops can protect some of these nutrient losses, particular nitrogen losses from this Red River Valley area.
And you talked about the sort of the nitrogen balance in the video, and of course right there as well. But how do you manage your cover crop program to keep that perfect balance?
So if you want to manage that one, because one thing keep in the mind, for the nitrogen supply to the sugar beet is critical. It does not, all other nutrients does not matter. Nitrogen really controls your root yield and sugar content. If you have bunch of nitrogen available in your soil, particularly during the late growing season, then what happens that it may increase your root yield, not that much, but it can lower your sugar content. So because you are going to have more vegetative growth, but not that much of reproductive or tuber growth. So you can lose your sugar content if you have bunch of nitrogen available during the in August. So today in morning, there is one question growers asked me that, should we apply some nutrients with the cover crop or not? Please don't apply any kind of nutrients with the cover crop, because our objective with the cover crops to reduce the nutrient losses. It is kind of a scavenger in the case of sugar beet production system. So from my perspective, I don't really suggest to apply nitrogen for the cover crops in the sugar beet system, because if your cover crops kind of fail due to the lack of moisture, that nitrogen in the soil can harm your sugar beet if you are applying during this June and July. So the thing is that if you are thinking about adjustment, if you have a 30-inch row spacing, suppose in the morning there is one grower asked me that if we have a 30-inch wider row spacing, you can go for late cover crop planting, like as late as July for interseeded cover crop. But if you have a close one, suppose like I have this experiment in 22-inch row spacing, then you may go a little bit earlier, like second or third week of June, to have this enough cover crop growth. Because if you are thinking about July and August, that is pretty much dry during this, unless you have like a sudden accidental rainfall. But so that you need to really make sure that you are getting some rainfall before or after your cover crops planting, because if it is too dry, it will not grow.
All right, thank you, Amit. Appreciate that. Greg, this is a question we had actually in an earlier panel, and you may have answered it because I know your video was work that you were doing in, planting green into cereal rye. But the question is this: it's what cover crop can be used in dry bean to protect from post-harvest erosion, and when and how should it be seeded? And then follow-up question to that is, what are the best cover crops for getting the max benefit in a short growing window? I know there's a lot there, but would love for you to take that whatever direction you find most productive.
Well, the work that we've been doing is with winter rye, of course, planting it the fall before the dry beans are produced. We have not done any work after the dry beans are harvested. There would be opportunities there, like what Hans Kandel had talked about with soybean, where maybe the cover crop could be broadcast near the end of the dry bean production season, maybe when the leaf drop begins, if there is adequate moisture for the cover crop to take. And of course, when dry beans nears when we can harvest early, sometimes we can get the dry beans off in early September. We could follow up quickly with planting a cool season crop and maybe have 6-8 weeks of growth, anything to provide some land cover. So, but my experience has been with winter rye, and experience has been good. If people, when you looked at the video, and you might have wondered, well, he must be greatly against planting green. I'm not. I'm against farmer failure. And so I'm just trying to put out the word of caution and make sure that people are watching the rye closely. In areas in North Dakota, much of North Dakota, we certainly have variable soil moisture and rainfall. And so we just want people to be watching the rye as they consider their termination timing and planting for either soybean or dry bean. In our work with the rye before the dry bean, we're looking at things such as, can we maintain our dry bean yield with the rye in the system? And how about weed control? We hear a lot about weed suppression with rye, but is it actually a viable tool for weed management? So we've been exploring those things, and the answers, in my opinion, are yes. We've been able to achieve some very good pinto bean yields with using rye in the system. And weed management has looked good. It's not going to be, in most cases, a substitute for pre-emergence herbicides, although I've found that in the research, but it's more of a supplement to our existing weed management strategies, primarily herbicides with dry bean weed management. And so I think that's good. I really get excited about the benefits of cover crops, mainly because of reducing soil erosion. And through the years, it just seems like dry bean fields are those that are really really susceptible to erosion, either before the crop is produced and certainly after. The first commercial field that I saw where rye was in, dry bean was in 2016 in Wells County. And I was just amazed. It was a beautiful field. This was in the middle part of July. The dry beans looked good. The rye residue was still present. Weeds were almost non-existent. And there was a combination of the rye as well as herbicides. And that's what really got me excited about, hey, let's fortify what's happening here with some research to back up what's looks like just a really promising strategy to help reduce soil erosion in dry bean, as well as some of the other benefits. So it took a long time to maybe answer the question. Maybe I didn't do that properly.
I mean, that was great. That was fantastic. And I don't know if you saw this in the chat or you're reading our minds, but you answered a couple of the next questions that came from the audience. One of them was on weed suppression, and you said you were seeing good results on weed suppression. Can you speak to that a little bit further? What are you seeing? What is the data showing as far as how effective is this to help with weed suppression?
So I've been working with both soybean and dry bean and trying to generate numbers with soybean suppression or weed control. And certainly suppression would be the good application on assessing the how it's working. We've looked at primarily foxtail, and then this past season, actually, I've been able to assess some kochia and common lamb's quarter control as well. And so with all of these weeds, there's quite a range on control. It just depends on, for example, with the rye, how much growth there was, what the plant density is, and actually when a person's doing the evaluation, and if we have resistant weeds or not. So there's a lot of variables there, but certainly rye could be considered a nice supplement to our existing weed management tools. You know, in dry bean, where we have a fair amount of soil applied herbicides, but after that, it slips considerably on other options, and in particular, post-emergence broadleaf herbicides. We have very little there, especially considering the number of herbicide-resistant weeds that we have. So the rye certainly helps. In our studies, when we've compared leaving the rye as long as we could, in other words, planting green, we've seen as good of control of foxtail, for example, as if we used a pre-emergence herbicide, say several weeks before the rye is terminated. So they are very similar in the amount of suppression of the weeds. It looks, rye also looks very good with kochia. We feel very good about the pigweed species as well, such as redwood pigweed or water hemp. And so there's a lot of good things happening with weed suppression with using rye in the dry bean system.
Thank you, Greg. All right, co-host, you ready to take on all these sunflower questions we're getting here?
Holy buckets, yeah.
All right, let's start with this one. What's a good mix for interseeding into sunflower?
You know, we can make all kinds of recommendations on a mix, but honestly, the best mix is the mix that you are most comfortable seeding. And so when we first started this, we looked at 5 or 6 different mixes, and we had them side by side, and we got some very expensive mixes out of Kansas that farmers have been using down there. We asked Marisol Berti at NDSU for some mixes. We developed our own. And basically what we did when we did that is we evaluated which species in those mixes we liked best, and then we made our own mix. So there's a little bit of a fine-tuning process that happens where you're evaluating what's happening, you're seeing if it's a good fit, if you can control those weeds, if they do go to seed, is it a big issue for you the next year? And so the mix that we came up with that I showed in that video of having a grass in there like oats, we had buckwheat, flax, oh boy, crimson clover. We've tried a couple other things in there too. Peas were a great option. Those were all things we felt like we could control. And we got it down to $18 an acre. So for us, when it did get terminated at desiccation, our hearts weren't broken. Yeah, we wanted the green there, but it wasn't a huge investment to make us, really wish that we hadn't put the mix in there. So honestly, the mix you choose should be one that you're very comfortable planting. If there's something in there that you don't like or you're uncomfortable with, then don't plant it. Let's see, the other thing I'm seeing on there is any extra field management before planting, and I don't remember anything that we did differently prior to planting. When we planted the cover crops at the same time as the sunflower, we had a 2-inch depth on the sunflower planting, and then the cover crops are going in at 1/4 to 1 inch. So there wasn't anything, there with seeding of the cover crops that was going to interrupt or disturb the planting of the sunflowers. The farmers still chose to apply a pre-emerge, and that was not, it set back some of those cover crops, but it didn't hurt any of them that we had in our mix. So we felt pretty good about that you could just kind of do what you're doing in that mix, or in that your plan with your herbicides on that field. And impacting yield, I mean, that's always the thing we're looking at, and especially when you're planting a cover crop at the same time as your cash crop. And we've done this for 3 years. Kaylee Gash has analyzed the data, and we did them on field scale strips. So we were going 60 to 100 feet within the field at 10 to 20 feet wide, and we didn't see any significant difference in yield where there was cover crop versus no cover crop. That being said, there was a 200-pound difference in the averages of the sunflower yield, and the 200-pound difference was enough for that farmer to be just a little concerned. And so in that case, even though there's no statistical difference because the variability was so great that we couldn't see a difference, the 200 pounds difference means that maybe you don't do the whole field. You do the edges of the field. You do a couple of the drainage ditches in the field. You make sure that you're not, putting it everywhere and kind of hedging your bets and reducing risk in that way.
Great. Well, I think we got to most of those questions there. So thank you. Keep the questions rolling in, please, on any of these, projects that we're talking about. Amit, let's go back to you here on the sugar beets. You made a comment earlier about how, hey, everybody thinks that it has to be rye, that has to be the cover crop, but that's not necessarily true. Can you talk about the types of cover crops that you've worked with in a sugar beet system?
So I have for cover crop species, I have like winter rye, camelina, mustard, and pea. And this year only, I have included the flax and winter wheat, because flax actually, Dr. Goose of Soil Science Department, he kind of told me that, well, it will be interesting to include flax, because when in winter, flax, those has that upright dry out stem, and that can hold some snow as a barrier, and it can recharge the water. So I included flax. And winter wheat also, it kind of overwinters, and it is just like that another option besides rye, because everybody is hearing about rye, so that they just like to see some, okay, what are the other options we have besides rye, So I have included that winter wheat. And from my 3 years of results, that what we saw, that thing, that if you are thinking about, it depends on what is your objective. You need to first set out your objective for, okay, why I am going to include a cover crop in my rotation. If you think that, okay, I just like to have some improve my soil health and include more diversity in my rotation, I think that you can go for like this oilseed crops like camelina and mustard, because it does not really going to scare you, because it does not have that much of biomass. But what we observed, that it has some impact, because in case of cover crops, sometimes we could not measure some of the positive impact it has. Suppose like maybe those oilseed crops kind of has some benefit, or they protect the sugar beet from the pathogens like nematodes that we could not measure, or we did not measure those things. Another thing is that, suppose like if you are thinking about like, okay, I like to kind of trap those nitrogens, and I like to protect some of my ground against the erosion during the fall, go for some of those cereal rye or winter rye crop as a cover crop, so that can protect your ground.
Can I ask you a question, Amit? With harvest, having that interseeded cover crop and then sugar beet harvest, are there any issues with going through harvest?
Well, Abby, means all the people there, means sugar beet growers, they are mainly skeptical about this one, that whether this one is going to cover crop, this standing cover crops is going to give us any trouble during the harvesting. I have not seen any trouble because they are just nicely lying down in between your sugar beet rows whenever you are defoliating. One thing I just observed, because during the defoliation this year particularly, because we have profuse this pea biomass, we saw sometimes it makes noise, but you should not be scared, because when that defoliator, those spokes, they hit each other, they kind of make some noise. So whenever you are rolling those pea biomass and whenever you are defoliating that area, that can make some noise, but it should not give you any trouble. But if you're asking me, there is a kind of that noise are kind of going to scare you, that is a rolling on the ground for the peas, and it is kind of natural for those ones. But besides that one, I did not see any trouble during the beet harvest in my 3 years of experience.
I'll ask this question to you, but Abbey or Greg, if you have any comments, you can chime in too. We have a question from the audience about your knowledge on seed coat polymers on cover crop seed that delay germination after the cash crop establishment. Is that anything that you have any experience with?
Well, I did not have any experience, but when I am planting, because we planted this one by hand, all those camelina and mustard. That time I thought about that thing, that if we have a seed coated polymer, then it will give us a better control on planting those cover crops, because if you have, suppose like 10 pounds per acre, even whenever you are doing that thing, if you have a seed coated polymer that kind of coats your seed, but one thing that will give you trouble, it will delay, but how long it is going to delay. And then when that polymer coat breaks down, what will be your soil moisture level? That we could not predict. So that can give you a trouble. So whenever you are dried out and your seed coat polymer breaks down, then it may not germinate. So that you need to be critical, but it will definitely help for if you are going for like particularly for camelina or mustard, where you have really small seeds. That I was actually thinking that if we have, whenever you are talking about different mixes, if they can come up with bunch of seeds in a polymer or polymer coated seeds, it will be good. But only problem will be that we don't know that whether it will crack down and that will get a moisture or not. But whenever you are like planting those nakeds or without polymer, then you know that okay, I have some enough moisture to get that thing germinated. So that is a kind of a risk.
Thank you, Amit. Greg, we'll send this question over to you. We talked about weed suppression in the dry beans, which obviously your work was focusing on, as well as you said soybeans. I have a question from the audience about the rye resulting in weed pressure reduction via, allelopathy, ground cover, water. Are there crops that it particularly affects? The allelopathy, I guess, of the rye is the way I'm understanding this question.
Well, the legumes work well with rye, and such as the soybean and dry bean. And that's why we're a little bit concerned about some of the grass crops and why there's certainly a waiting period between termination of rye and say following up with a corn crop. And we also do not recommend rye before our small grain for other reasons, but including allelopathy is a concern as well. So we can also look at that on the weed management aspect, and that is that yes, the rye does a nice job on suppressing many weeds, but don't be surprised if there are some new weed species that appear in a system where you include rye, and not just the year that a person is using rye, say in soybean or dry bean, but in other parts of the 3 or 4 rotation, whatever you might have. So as an example, we're finding that any weeds that are in the legume family or in the mint family, they might be suspects or outlaws, if you will, that might be showing up where you have rye with the goal of trying to suppress weeds. And so if a person, say, had cover crops in their system and which included, say, black medic or hairy vetch would be a really good example. I've heard of commercial growers that said they've had hairy vetch show up, even though they haven't had it for a long time or didn't know they even had any seed in their fields. So just be aware of that. And then at the Carrington Center, I've mentioned this during our cafe talks earlier today that we have a weed, it's in the mint family called lance leaf sage. It's relatively common in North Dakota, and that seems to come through the rye. So Mother Nature's pretty smart, and we can suppress a lot of weeds, but there always seems to be something that'll replace those that we suppress. So just like so many people mentioned today, requires management with cover crops, and there's always new things to be on the lookout for.
Thank you, Greg. Well, we do have a few more questions that we have not got to, but we are up on time. So I'd encourage you, if you had a question and it didn't get answered, please put it in the chat, and we'll see if our panelists can engage with you on that chat. But I do want to give each of the three of you one more chance for kind of a final word. So anything you either want to emphasize that we talked about, or something you were hoping to bring up in our panel session today that you didn't get a chance to do. And Abby, let's start with you.
Sure. I think the biggest thing with trying some of these practices, especially in a crop where you're unsure of how it's going to work, is you don't have to do the whole field. And so when I talked about with the sunflowers, seeding the cover crops around the field borders or in strips where you have some problematic parts of the field, I think keep in mind that when you're trying these practices, number one, you should start small, like was mentioned by the farmer panel, but then also to know that you don't have to do the whole field to get some of those benefits. So if you're looking to draw on beneficial insects, maybe doing the border of the field might be enough. So just keep that in mind as you use these practices.
Great. And Amit, any final words from you?
I just like to emphasize Abby's word, particularly for during the fall or after your harvest. Suppose like one grower at Ada, he did that thing that he planted cover crop on the headlands. in the headlands, and just try out and tailor your management, cover crop management practices by yourself so that you can adopt to that thing and just take the risk. And I think that you will get the benefit in the long run.
Thanks so much, Amit. And Greg.
Yes, my message would be that each year NDSU Extension and North Harvest conduct a survey of growers in Minnesota and North Dakota, dry bean growers, on production practices. And what we find is that we have the majority of acres still are conventional tilled. So we have a lot of work to do yet to get that number to go down on conventional tillage and go up on reduced tillage. And we also have found that there's people that are using covered crops, but it's a relatively low percentage, about 20%. So let's get those covered crops up in dry beans and get the tillage down.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Greg. Great panel to all three of you.